There are two kinds of stories that we can tell about the food prices. One is an economic story, and that's a story about a perfect storm of poor harvests and a demand for meat in developing countries, which is diverting grain, and a high price of oil, which is driving up food, sort of farm inputs. At the same time, the biofuels boom, the process of growing growing food in order to burn it rather than eat it. All of these are economic factors that are driving up the price of food. But at the same time, there's a political story here, and it's a longer-term political story about how countries have been forced to abandon their support for farmers and to abandon things like grain supplies and grain stores. This is a longer-term story, and it involves organizations like the World Bank and the World Trade Organization that have a sort of fairly iron control over the economies of most of the poorest countries in the world. And what the World Bank and what the WTO and, to some extent, the International Monetary Fund have done is force these countries to tie their hands behind their back, effectively, and to bind them very firmly to an international economy in food. And the consequence of that is that when the price of food goes up, these economies have very little recourse and very little possibility of defending themselves economically. But my allegiances are and always have been with the people on the streets, and I'm working right now with shack dwellers in Durban in South Africa, but also I'm connected to groups of peasants and of landless people around the world by occasionally doing some research for Via Campesina, the international peasant movement that by some estimates has over 100 million members. So I'm definitely more connected and more supportive of their efforts to develop a more positive and more genuine food democracy. I mean, to some extent, there's a lot of creative denial about the suffering that these organizations cause. I mean, certainly within the World Bank, when I worked there was a banner, sort of 5 stories high as you went into the World Bank building, with a beautiful African child on it, and beneath it the slogan, "Our dream is a world free of poverty." And certainly there was a sort of myth-making enterprise within the World Bank that everything they were doing was for the benefit of the poor, whether the poor liked it or not. So I certainly think that there's a sense that when things are tough, it's tough love that comes from the World Bank. But I don't think that they're terribly connected to the movements of poor people around the world who are very articulately saying that what the World Bank is doing is actively destructive. And that's, in fact, one of the reasons that Via Campesina, the international peasant movement, started, was because the World Bank was introducing agricultural policy throughout the developing world. But they were doing it without any reference to the farmers' movements that existed, or the movement of landless people that existed. And those movements got together to fight back against the World Bank. And they continue to fight back against the World Bank, and the World Bank has very little, if any, contact with them at all.
Raj, talk about coffee.
The price of coffee is absolutely a function of the way the food system works today. If you look at the path that coffee takes from the field to our cups, you'll see that the farmers get paid a pittance. The processors get paid a little bit more, sort of 20–30 cents a kilo. The grain exporters get paid a little bit more, sort of 50–60 cents a kilo. But by the time it gets processed and turned into instant coffee, it's nearer $30 a kilo. And the people who make the most money out of that process are the coffee processors, the big international coffee traders, companies like Nestle, for example. And that's indicative of the way the food system works in general. I mean, if you imagine a sort of hourglass, at the top there are the millions of farmers who grow the food that we eat, and at the bottom there are billions of us consumers. And in the middle, there are just a handful of corporations that mediate between the people who grow our food and us. And those corporations, in many cases, it's usually 4 corporations controlling more than 50% of the market. I mean, in tea, for example, one company, Unilever, controls holds 90% of the market. Now, when you're in that position of market power, you're able to do a great deal. First, you're able to drive prices down for farmers, and of course the irony there is that farmers and farm workers are the poorest people on the planet. So you're paying the poorest people on the planet the least, and then you're processing the food so that what we end up with is food that is rich in salts and fats and sugars, food that tends to make us want to buy more, food that makes us obese. And that's why you're having a situation where there are 6 billion people in the world, 1 billion of whom are now overweight. In the past, it used to be that the people who were overweight were rich, excuse me, and the people who were hungry were poor. Today, hunger and obesity are both signs that people are unable to control their diets. They're unable to control, not in a sort of willpower way, but unable to control in terms of being able to access fresh fruits and vegetables, access food that is healthy. I mean, in the United States, for example, it's much harder for communities of poor people, and people of color in particular, to access fresh fruits and vegetables. In West Oakland, for example, near where I live, you have a situation where there's just one supermarket in West Oakland and dozens and dozens of liquor stores where there is no fresh fruit and vegetable, but there are these highly processed industrial foods. Now that's a sign that, in fact, I mean, it would be wonderful for all of us to be able to access these fresh fruits and vegetables, but at the moment, and particularly for people who on low incomes, that's pretty tough to do. And so the environments in which poor people find themselves and which are being built around poor people are more conducive to being overweight and to be unhealthy in the cities. And for poor people in the fields, those kinds of prices that come from the industrial food system are driving them out of business.
Soy. Can you talk about soy?
Soy is the ingredient. I mean, it's weird. It's the perfect crop in so many ways. It's rich in proteins. It's great for the soil. It's really robust. But because the way that we grow soy is through industrial agriculture and monoculture, that process of growing it takes these biological virtues and turns them into social ills. Soy is now in 3/4 of everything, of processed foods on the supermarket shelves, and in almost everything that the fast food industry brings us. Now, soy is, I mean, and it's in these foods because it's very flexible. It can be used as a vegetable oil. It can be used as an emulsifier. It can be used as an additive in meat, for example. But the trouble is, of course, that a lot of the soy that's grown in the world, it comes from Brazil. Brazil is, by some measures, the world's largest soy exporter. And those soy plantations have been encroaching on the Brazilian Cerrado and also on the rainforest. Soy farmers are going into the rainforest, chopping it down and growing soy. And worse yet, Brazil is home to, according to the International Labour Organization, home to 50,000 slaves who work on soy plantations and also the majority of work in biofuels plantations and sugarcane plantations. And it's through the exploitation of these people that we're able to have cheap meat, that we're able to have these sort of food additives that shave a couple of cents off the price of our food. So yeah, I mean, the soy becomes emblematic of everything that's wrong about the way we produce food, and offers hope about the way we might reconnect to food in a different way. The history of it in industrial capitalism and food is very long indeed. I mean, the East India Company, for example, the British East India Company was responsible for driving the colonization of India. And of the subsequent imposition of markets in food. But in the 20th century, I mean, the poster child for corporate malfeasance is the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company controlled vast swathes of Central America, and it's for their control of that part of the world for growing bananas that we have the term Banana Republic. And Banana Republic is a sort of abject case of blaming the victim. These banana republics existed because the tin pot dictators who ran them were in the thrall and responsible to the United Fruit Company, rather than actually to the people over whom they ruled. Now, the United Fruit Company found itself in Guatemala, where a democratically elected president wanted to institute just a basic fair system of taxation. And so he wanted to, this was Jacobo Guzman, I believe, who wanted to tax the land at a fair market value. Now, rather than allow that, the United Fruit Company called its friends in the CIA, who instigated a coup. And as a result of that coup, there was a bloody civil war for 40 years. 200,000 people died, and also that we could have cheap bananas. Now, that kind of utter manipulation of international economies is something that isn't just happening in the global south. It's happening right here in the United States.